You're listening to the Radical Ideas Podcast. Episode 2, The Justice Society. We start off in the year 1943 on the island of Themyscira. We sweep through the city streets, showing nothing but women in Greek clothing and armor living their lives. We see a bustling marketplace, we see artists creating, we see an amphitheater with a play being performed, and then we see a coliseum and we hear the crowd. Zooming in, we see dozens of Amazonian warriors all exhibiting feats of strength and speed far above those of regular mortals, and all of these women are fighting the same single opponent, Princess Diana. She is tall, she is muscular, she is statuesque, and she is kind of kicking everyone's butt. When compared to these already super women, Diana seems a step above. She is displaying feats of super speed that the other women don't seem to have to dodge out of the way of attacks. She is using a pair of metal bracers on her forearms to deflect arrows and other projectiles being hurled towards her. And then, when a dozen women manage to wrap a lasso around one of Diana's arms, single-handedly, Diana wins in this bout of tug-of-war against the other women. And with that, a victory horn is sounded, and the crowd stands up, cheering. Diana is once again crowned the victor of the Colosseum. As Diana is looking into the crowd, she makes eye contact with someone. Her mother, the Queen Hippolyta. She is obviously very proud of her daughter, and nods in congratulation. After the battle, Diana and her mother go on a walk together. Hippolyta is complimenting her daughter on her latest victory, and Diana thanks her, but says that as the only champion of the gods on the island, the victory feels somewhat hollow. Diana mentions that she's beginning to grow tired of life here on the island, and that she's curious about the world of man. Hippolyta cannot blame her daughter. Many of their sisters have grown tired of life here on the island, and went on to form their own tribes of Amazons out in the world. But none of them have yet deemed the world of man suitable to live in, fully integrated. Diana argues that their data must be flawed. After all, the only experience that any of the women from Themyscira get with the outside world and the world of man is either when they are banished, or when they are let out to go try and find a mate if they want to have a child. Hippolyta reminds her daughter that it was the violence of the world of man that caused the Amazons to leave and isolate themselves all those centuries ago. But Diana says that only further proves her point. The last true contact they had with the world of man was over 2,000 years ago, before she was even born. All of their sister tribes split off over 500 years ago, and even the last Amazonian to be banished to the world of man was over a century ago. The world of man must be better by now. And Hippolyta simply places her hand on her daughter's face and says that she loves her optimism, but still holds her doubts. She will consider what Diana said here today, and the women go their separate ways. Later that night, we go to the Temple of the Oracles atop the mountain on the island of Themyscira, and we see an oracle named Calliope have a vision so terrible that she begins to scream. Queen Hippolyta is rushed from her quarters to the Temple of the Oracles, where she is given a prophecy. Calliope has seen a leader in the world of men. He has amassed an army, a fanatical group believing themselves to be a master race, and they want to see the world burn. But there is hope. A champion of Themyscira must head into the world of man and find champions of justice to aid her. And together, they can stop what is to come. Hearing this, Queen Hippolyta knows what must be done, and she summons her daughter, telling her that she will get her wish, and she issues Diana this quest. Diana immediately leaves to gather her gifts from the gods: armor, a sword, and her bracers forged for her by Hephaestus himself, and the lariat of Gaia, a golden, magical lariat that when wrapped around someone would force them to speak the truth. And with these, Diana left. She headed to the Themysciran docks, where they keep their magical ships. Diana steps aboard a magical trireme, which has been enchanted to take her to the lands where she is needed. Diana turns and waves goodbye to her sisters, and the ship sets sail. It sails out of the enchanted barrier that surrounds the islands and into the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Despite the waves crashing and the ship bouncing, Diana stands unmoved as they sail towards the shore of southern Italy. And when they reach the shore, Diana disembarks. She turns around and pats the ship, which then magically turns around and sails itself back to the island of Themyscira. Turning back towards the world of man, Diana takes a deep breath, and she begins to fly. Diana takes some time to revel and enjoy the sensation of flying through a sky that she has never flown in before, above land that she has never stepped on before. She smiles as she embraces this new sense of freedom, and then she turns her eyes back to the ground to begin her mission. After flying for a while, Diana finally lays her eyes on a small village. She descends and watches the people from afar, where she sees a woman and her daughter. They are out hanging laundry on a laundry line, and Diana smiles at this familiar sight. And then she sees something she has never seen in her entire life: a little boy running up to the two women. Clearly, this is the girl's younger brother and the son of the woman, and Diana beams. This is the first man she has ever seen. She continues watching, and she sees multiple men and women in this village living comfortable, happy lives together in harmony. Diana flies away in search of other villages, and as she flies, she basks in the beauty of the Italian landscape. She flies over and checks on several villages, appreciating each and every one of them. But as she is flying, she eventually hears a strange sound, one that we would recognize as gunshots. Diana flies towards the source of these strange sounds, and that is when she finds a village under attack by Nazis. A Nazi soldier is dragging a woman out of her house by her hair, but Diana lands next to him and orders him to unhand her. The soldier refuses, and so Diana grabs his forearm and squeezes, shattering it. A group of Nazis loading villagers into a truck sees this, and they all open fire on Diana. She effortlessly deflects all of the bullets with her bracers, sending the bullets flying back at the men who fired them. The truck then revs its engine and takes off with the group of screaming civilians in the back. But Diana pulls out her lariat and lassos around one of the truck's wheels, and with a yank, she rips the entire axle off of the truck, sending it falling into the mud. Diana takes her time and rounds up all of the Nazis, not killing any of them herself just yet, but leaving them to be judged by the villagers who they had sought to kidnap. Going to the most decorated of the soldiers, Diana wraps her lariat around him and forces him to tell her where he came from. He says that he was sent from the north, and so Diana flies that way. As she does, she finds several villages in ruin, and Diana stops to help as many as she possibly can. She speaks with many of the local villagers who all tell her the same thing, that the Nazis have been taking some of their friends and family. But eventually Diana comes across a village that has been almost completely destroyed. She flies down to help, and when she asks them what caused this, one of the villagers looks at her and says, "The metal soldiers." Diana then looks down and sees a massive treaded footprint in the dirt, and Diana follows a trail of them. It is soon nighttime, and as Diana is following the trail, she sees that it leads to a city that is currently burning. and so she flies in to help. Diana stops a building from collapsing and helps villagers run outside to safety. But as she is ushering some of the villagers to safety, she hears a loud thud, the sound of metal footsteps, and as she looks into the smoke, she sees the silhouette of a man. But it grows bigger and bigger until an over 10-foot tall automaton steps out of the smoke. It lays eyes on Diana and immediately attacks. Diana pushes the people back to safety and leaps into action against this machine. They fight, and Diana is able to win, ripping the machine's arms off and knocking it to the ground. She turns back to the group of villagers she had been helping and escorts them to the center of the city. But when they reach there, they hear screams. Hundreds of more villagers run into the middle of this town, and Diana hears more metallic thuds. She sees that there are dozens more of the robots that she had just faced, and they are herding the townsfolk into the town square. Diana draws her sword and shield, but is scared. She can easily defeat all of these robots, but she will not be able to defeat all of them and save all of these townsfolk. And suddenly, all of the robots' hands open up, revealing machine guns, and they all begin to fire. But suddenly, there is a burst of golden light, and floating out of the middle of the crowd is a man in a golden helmet, blue suit, and golden cape, and before any bullets can hit any of the townsfolk, a magical golden barrier in the shape of an ankh descends from the sky, deflecting all of the bullets. As the robots maintain their fire on this golden barrier, there is a loud, concussive burst of sound, which knocks several of the robots to the ground. And we see a blonde woman with a black domino mask. As she finishes her battle cry, we see that one of the robots has turned its arm to face her and opens fire. But before she is hit, a smaller green barrier appears, protecting her. And we see that the green barrier is being projected by a man wearing a green ring, a red shirt, a purple cape, and a green domino mask. Just then, a golden flash of feathery wings flies past the man, and we see a large man in strange hawk-like armor with massive feathered wings brandishing a mace as he knocks a head off of the assailing machine. And as it falls to the ground, we see a bright red blur flash across the battlefield to all of the knocked down robots, which all suddenly fall apart, as if they had been meticulously disassembled. The blur comes to a stop, and we see a man wearing a metal World War I era helmet and a red jacket, brandishing a wrench. Yet another robot standing behind this man swings down in an attempt to crush the red blur, but its arms are caught by a man in a yellow cloak. He pushes the robot's fist back, and then the robot begins to glitch out, as phasing through its chest, we see a man wearing white with a black and red cape and glowing red eyes. He then turns around to the glitching robot and fires heat beams from his eyes, cutting the robot in half. The man in the golden helmet now drops the Ankh force field as enough robots have been defeated, and fires 2 blasts of magical energy at a pair of other robots. And seeing her opportunity, Diana leaps into the fray as well, astonishing this group of super people. Diana dismembers and beheads several of the robots, but one of them fires off a mortar blast before Diana can chop off its arm. The mortar blast hits the town clock tower, and the tower falls down on the crowd of people. Diana rushes towards it, but is beaten, and we see that the tower itself is caught and held up by a man in red with a white lightning bolt on his chest and a white capelet on his back. He turns to Diana and he says, "Don't worry, ma'am. You focus on fighting those robots. I'll protect the people." And he flashes a disarmingly optimistic smile at her. Diana works together with this supergroup to defeat all of the robots and then purge the Nazis from this town and gather them all up. When the fight is finally done, Diana turns around and is pleased to see that this group of heroes have actually started to help repair the damage to the town. The man in white and the man with the golden helmet are using magic and telekinesis to repair damage to some of the buildings. The two men wearing red are doing small repairs and helping the people. The hawk-like man and the blonde woman in the domino mask are helping out civilians, and the man wearing the yellow cloak is treating the wounded. And as she approaches them, the man in red with the white lightning bolt on his chest turns to her and says, "Hello, ma'am. Might I say you are a real wonder out there. My name is Captain William Batson, but you can call me Billy. And if you don't mind me asking, what's your name?" Diana is politely taken aback by just how nice this man seems to be, and she reaches out and shakes his hand and introduces herself as Princess Diana from the island of Themyscira, champion of the gods. Hearing that line about the champion, Billy hesitates for a moment and gives Diana a quick up and down, as if he's inspecting her for something. His curiosity seemingly abated, Billy says, "Well, ma'am, it's a pleasure to meet you. And may I introduce you to the rest of Task Force X?" First, he introduces her to the doctors, Kent Nelson, Carter Hall, and Rex Tyler, aka Dr. Fate, Hawkman, and Our Man. Next, he introduces her to Corporals Jay Garrick and Ellen Scott, aka The Flash and the Green Lantern. And finally, he introduces her to Privates Dinah Drake and Raphael Quintus, aka Black Canary and Bloodwind. Looking at them all, Diana asks if they are the champions of justice. They all look at each other, confused, not knowing what she's referring to, and she says that she was sent here for a prophecy, that she needed to find the champions of justice, and working together, they would stop the army of the master race. And hearing that, Task Force X are all in agreement that they must be the champions she is referring to, because they are definitely fighting against the army of the master race. But Task Force X are no fools. It is quite the coincidence to run into a super-powered individual in the middle of Nazi territory, and so they ask if she will consent to let Raphael read her mind. Diana seems a bit taken aback, but she completely understands their caution, and she consents. She turns to Bloodwind, and Bloodwind looks at her, and suddenly his voice appears in her mind and asks for her consent to read her thoughts. She agrees, and Raphael probes Diana's mind. And after a few seconds, he looks to the rest of Task Force X and confirms she is who she says, and she is here to help. They welcome her into the group, and Billy Batson remarks that he's going to have to think of a cool nickname for her too. Task Force X spends the rest of the day helping the town rebuild, and that night they are treated by the townsfolk to a large dinner at a local inn, where they all get to talking and knowing each other a little bit more. Dr. Fate and Hawkman elect to take the first patrol of the night, and so they leave dinner. Over food, Black Canary cannot stop asking Diana about the island she comes from. She is fascinated by it. An entire island full of nothing but women, and men aren't allowed? Please, can I move there? Diana laughs and agrees that once this whole thing is over, she will speak to her mother about having Black Canary come and visit the island. Billy asks if he can go too, but Dinah Drake reminds him that men aren't allowed on the island. And Billy seems bummed, and he says he is just excited because he heard that Diana is a champion of the gods, and so is he. Diana asks him what he means by that, and Billy explains that he got his powers from a wizard. When he was just a kid, this old man found him and took him in, and it turns out that man was a wizard, and he gifted Billy with powers. He said that he was given the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the endurance of Atlas, the power of Zeus, the courage of Achilles, and the speed of Mercury. Diana is stunned, because when she was a little girl, thousands of years ago, her mother told her a tale of a wizard named Mamaragon who visited the Greek gods. He wanted a sliver of their power and power of some of their greatest champions, and in return, he would teach them some of his magics. Billy guffaws at that and comments that at this rate, he and Diana are basically cousins. Diana laughs at this and raises a glass to Captain Marvel and says, "Well then, drink up, cousin." Diana then asks them about the robots that they've been fighting, and Jay Garrick speaks up, saying that these robots are the invention of a mad Nazi scientist named Dr. Tomek Ovadia Moro. The task force had already found and arrested him, but what they couldn't find was the secret manufacturing factory, the source of the robots, where his plans were sent to. But even then, the robots are nothing compared to the new super weapon that they've been tracking for the last couple weeks. Its codename is Ubermensch. And we cut to a battlefield hundreds of miles away, and we see a Nazi officer in his mid to late 20s, with short blonde hair and bright blue eyes. He is nervously pacing in his tent. He is approached by an older man with thick dark hair and a thick black beard, wearing a small pair of spectacles. He places his hand on the blonde man's shoulder, and he says, "Don't worry, my son. Go. Show them the glory of the master race." And so Captain Albrecht Krieger thanks his father, and there's a loud explosion heard outside. Dr. Wolfgang Krieger turns to his son and urges him to head out to the battlefield. Albrecht steps out of the tent, and we see that there is a full-blown battle going on between the US and Nazi forces. Albrecht is wearing a pristine Nazi uniform with a large, flowing cape. Immediately after exiting his tent, he is spotted by an American sniper up in a clock tower. The sniper takes aim and fires, and we watch as the bullet races towards Albrecht, hitting him directly in the skull, and it bounces off. Albrecht looks towards the clock tower, and then, as German orchestral music begins to swell, he takes off into the air. And Albrecht begins his rampage. He is tearing US soldiers apart. We see a US tank turn a corner from around a building and fire at him, but he catches the shell mid-air and then throws it back at the clock tower where the sniper had shot at him from earlier. He then zips down to the tank, crushes the cannon in his hand so that the next shell fired from it destroys the cannon itself, before he picks up the entire thing, flies into the air, and throws it down on a group of US soldiers. We then cut back to Dr. Wolfgang Krieger. Standing beside him is a blonde woman who appears maybe in her mid to late 20s. But confusingly, she comments that their son is glorious and will make a great leader one day. And a maniacal grin spreads across her face as she says that the world will bow before them. Seeing his wife's joy, Dr. Krieger grins as well, and they watch as their son continues his slaughter of the US forces. The battlefield then fades to daytime, and we see that it is several days later on the same battlefield, and Task Force X has arrived to investigate the scene, and they are wondering what could have caused this. That is when Jay Garrick calls out. He has found a Nazi survivor. The task force dig him out of the dirt, and they decide that they're going to interrogate him. Bloodwind hovers close to the man, his eyes glowing red, saying, "I will make him talk." But Diana stops him, and instead pulls out her lariat of Gaia. She wraps it around the Nazi, and it begins to glow, and we see Diana interrogate him, as he spills all the beans. Watching this, Billy Batson whistles and says, "Whew! A lasso of truth? Neat." As Diana interrogates the soldier, we follow Rex Tyler as he is still investigating the scene, and he finds something that makes his face grow cold. He picks up a scrap of metal and returns to the task force just as Diana makes the Nazi talk, and the Nazi confesses that this was the work of the Ubermensch, but the Ubermensch isn't just a weapon. The Ubermensch is Captain Albrecht Krieger. He was genetically altered by his father, Dr. Wolfgang Krieger, and turned into a Nazi super soldier, a true, perfect example of the master race. Even though the Nazi is compelled to tell the truth, the task force doesn't want to believe this, but this is when Rex Tyler gets there with the piece of metal that he found, and he turns it around to reveal a human handprint perfectly embossed in the steel. And he says, "Not even my Miraclo would make me this strong." But Rex points out one thing they have going for them. By the sounds of it, Albrecht is the only super soldier they have. Just like the problems that Rex Tyler is facing with his own Miraclo, only Rex Tyler himself can take it. The exact dosages, chemical composition of the medicine that he takes to become our man would need to be specifically reformulated for every single individual who takes it. So at the very least, they've gotten here before Dr. Wolfgang Krieger can mass produce whatever it is he's been treating his son with. The task force continues on, and they find another group of US soldiers under attack by Nazi forces. They leap into action and help them, defeating even more robots, but after the battle is won, Diana notices some of the US soldiers harassing Black Canary, one of them even grabbing her arm. The soldier remarks that women have no place here on the battlefield. They're making a mockery of warfare, and they should be back home in the kitchen where they belong. Diana then grabs the man's arm, where he is grabbing Dinah Drake. The soldier violently tries to pull his arm away from Diana's grip, but he is too weak. He pulls and pulls, but Diana stands there unmoving, staring daggers into this man's soul. But Dinah Drake convinces Diana to let him go, and the man walks off in a huff. Diana asks Dinah why the man would say the things that he did, and Dinah sadly explains that is unfortunately just how the world works out here, which we see horrifies Diana. Dinah confirms women aren't allowed to serve in the military, but when her powers activated and she knew she had to do something to help, she went down to the recruiter's office. And when she sent the recruiter's truck flying down the street with a single shout, the recruiter quickly changed his tune. Diana and Dinah sit down to speak, with Diana asking Dinah where she got her abilities. And Dinah explains that she was born with them. Many of the women in her family are born with them. It runs back all the way to her Granny MacDougall back in Ireland. Dinah then begins gushing about her family back home, talking about how excited she is to see if her younger sister Sarah will eventually develop the Canary Cry too. Dinah insists that after the war, Diana has to come back with her and meet her family. And then she asks Diana if she has any family. And Diana explains that while she has no siblings, just a lot of women she would consider her sister, the only biological family that she has would be her mother and her aunt. Overhearing the happy talk of family, Rex Tyler joins in, and he shows Diana a picture in which we see a brand new born baby boy. He explains that it is his son, Richard. His wife, Wendy, recently gave birth, and he hasn't even gotten to meet his son yet. But as soon as this war is over, he is going right home, he is picking that boy up, and he is giving him the biggest smooch on the forehead. Overhearing Rex gush about his son, the rest of the task force show up and join into the conversation. Jay Garrick confirms that he also has no family waiting for him back home, but he does have his girl Joni, and as soon as he gets home, he is going to ask her to marry him. Alan Scott mentions that he is also seeing a woman. Her name is Rose. He gushes all about their life, the fun that they have together, going to museums, going out to eat, and that he can't wait to see her face again. The group turn to Carter Hall, and he just shrugs and says that his love life is long and complicated. And then he turns to Dr. Fate, who floats in the air unmoving. He speaks in two voices and says, "Kent and Inza Nelson will be together again one day. They are bound by fate." And finally the team turn to look at Raphael, and Raphael hesitates. We see that he's trying to find the right words, and he says that he had a wife and daughter, Mariah and Kim, but they were murdered by white supremacists. Staring out into the battlefield, Raphael says that he got the revenge on the men responsible for taking his family from him, and he left his home, only to find more of that same hatred here. After hearing that, Diana is quite saddened. She says that she had always hoped that the world of man would have gotten better in the thousands of years since her people have gone into isolation. But everything she was hearing makes it sound that like maybe it is best if her people stay separate. But Dinah places a hand on Diana's shoulder, and she says that she has faith. She thinks that people are just scared and don't know how to be better. That the world is living right now in a society based on fear, where the powerful are allowed to do whatever they want with no one to stand up to them. She says that they need to show them a society that can be better, one that can be kind, one that can be accepting, one where there can be real justice. Diana looks up at Dinah, grabs her hand, and smiles, saying that truly sounds wonderful. And Dinah looks down at Diana and shrieks giddily, saying, "I just thought of your call sign! Wonder Woman!" Dinah excitedly looks to Billy for his approval, as he is the one who has come up with all of the names so far, and Billy excitedly shouts out, "Yes!" And so the team agree that it is settled, and they all welcome Wonder Woman aboard. The camera then pans out, and we see that Task Force X are being watched by a Nazi spy. The Nazi spy runs out and eventually hops on a motorcycle and rides north to another camp, where we see him go directly to Captain Albrecht Krieger and tell him everything he saw. A band of superpowered American soldiers are here, and Captain Krieger gets him to swear to confirm that is what he saw. The soldier says, yes, it is. The Krieger family all look at each other and nod in agreement that this explains what has been happening to all of their robots. They don't have many left and will have to fall back to the factory soon. Albrecht turns to his mother, and she gives her son a very specific nod, who instantly grabs the Nazi soldier and breaks his neck. Turning to his father, he asks what they should do, and Dr. Krieger says that they need to deal with this quickly. A group of superpowered individuals is a threat to their rule. He will activate the last of his robots, and his son will lead them to battle against this task force. We cut back to Task Force X a few days later. They are walking into a city that seems eerily quiet. None of the civilians are willing to talk to them, and most of them have left the city streets. And then a mortar round hits and sends many of the team flying. Our man reaches into his pocket, pulls out his pills, and pops one and runs for cover. The team are ambushed and a battle begins. But as they are fighting, they hear something that we, the audience, would know to be a sonic boom, a sound that only the Flash is intimately familiar with. And as he's wondering what the Germans have that could cause something like that, in a burst of speed, Albrecht Krieger appears, sending the Flash flying backwards into a building. The team are scared and realize that they are now facing the Übermensch, and they leap into battle. Canary screams at him, but he dodges out of the way and heads towards Hawkman. The two fight mid-air, and the other heroes leap in to join. Down on the ground, we see Black Canary fighting off a group of robots as Our Man is digging through the rubble of the building that collapsed on top of Jay. He is struggling to lift some of the larger pieces of rock as Canary asks him when his powers will kick in, and Our Man says that it varies, but it's going to take a few minutes to take effect. But finally, he uncovers Jay, and we see that Jay Garrick is horribly wounded, but alive. Our Man pulls his friend out and begins to treat his wounds, setting Jay's broken limbs in place, and Jay urges his friend not to waste much time on him, just set his limbs and go, because he's got it from there. He's always been a fast healer. And we see as Jay begins to vibrate his body at super speed, and his wounds begin to stitch themselves closed. Back in the air, Diana, Hawkman, Dr. Fate, Captain Marvel, and Bloodwind are all fighting against Albrecht, and despite their numbers advantage, Albrecht seems to be doing remarkably well. The task force members are distracted, splitting their time between fighting the Übermensch and the robots firing at their ground-based team members. While fighting, Diana feels something off about Albrecht. He seems too good with his powers. This feels like he's had years of experience doing this. And what's more, his strength and durability are outmatching almost every single member of the team, with the sole exceptions of Billy and Diana. Bloodwind fires a psychic assault on Albrecht's mind, and that actually seems to work. Albrecht falls down, clutching his head, and we see as his veins bulge. But as that's happening, a Nazi soldier wielding a flamethrower aims at Bloodwind and fires. Bloodwind is caught on fire and lets out an inhuman shriek, catching everyone off guard. Bloodwind's body begins to morph and stretch, and we see as he turns from a dark-skinned man in a white suit into a green-skinned monster with red eyes. and the task force are stunned. But Albrecht takes this opportunity to retreat. He knows that even though he was doing well, this would be a losing battle to fight in these circumstances. But he has what he needs, and he flies back home. Back down on the ground, Our Man's powers have finally kicked in, and he jumps into the fight, and the group reassemble and manage to defeat the rest of the Nazi forces, before going back to the burned green figure that they knew as their friend Bloodwind. We cut back to Albrecht, who is flying at supersonic speeds back to a factory up in the mountains. We see that this is where the robots are being mass-produced, and Albrecht goes to his father and remarks that one of them attacked his mind somehow, to which Wolfgang Krieger lets out a frustrated huff, remarking that psychics are always a nuisance. This group of Americans has already stretched their resources too thin, and they are undoubtedly heading their way next. Wolfgang looks to his wife and his son and tells them, "We must be ready." We cut back to Task Force X. They are sitting around a campfire late at night, looking over the burned and healing body of their friend Bloodwind. And Bloodwind finally regains consciousness. The group are all scared, and Jay Garrick speaks out first, asking, "What are you?" Bloodwind looks at the people who were his friends, hesitates, but comes clean, and he states, "I am a Martian." Billy pipes in, saying, "Like on the radio?" And Bloodwind sighs, saying, "No, not like the radio. I am not here to invade, and I mean you no harm. I came here because I have nowhere else to go." Alan Scott asks what he means by that. Is he some sort of criminal running from the people of Mars, just hiding out here on Earth? What is he hiding from them? Why has he been lying to them this whole time? Jay calms his friend down, and Hawkman says that Alan does have a point. Why did he lie? How are they supposed to trust him now? And Bloodwind says that not everything I told you was a lie. Only parts. My name here on Earth is Raphael Quintus, but my Martian name is John Jones. Billy says, "Your alien name is John Jones?" And Black Canary punches Billy in the shoulder with a look on her face that clearly says, "Be quiet and be respectful." Jean continues, "On Mars, I was a member of our planetary law enforcement, the Mahontir. Roughly translated, those who hunt violent men. I served during a time of great disaster. My wife, Mariah, and my daughter, Kim, were murdered by white supremacists. White Martians. Jean then shapeshifts, turning into a white Martian, changing his skin tone to a snowy white. And he says, "No different than green, a purely aesthetic difference amongst the race of shapeshifters. But it was enough to start a genocide. The Mahontir fought back, but the white Martians had garnered too much fear and distrust amongst the Martian people. Civilians were killing each other in the streets, and eventually a terrorist organization known as Malafak unleashed a psychic virus to kill all of the Greens. But in their foolishness, they failed to account that the genetic difference between a white Martian and a green Martian was so negligible that the virus they concocted couldn't tell the difference between the two. 4 billion Martians died in a matter of days, and evidently I was immune, as were a handful of others. But white Martians made up the majority of the survivors, and the same prejudice finished everyone else." Jean turns back to Green and looks at his hands, saying, "I am the only survivor of my people, the last son of Mars. I stayed at my home alone for centuries. I buried all of my people. And when I thought I was alone, I heard something. A radio signal being broadcast from a nearby planet. I didn't know what to do. I was alone. I was scared, but that sound gave me hope. I flew here, through space. It took me years to get here, and finally I reached this planet. And when I arrived, I saw the beginnings of what had destroyed my planet here. I witnessed white humans attacking black ones, and I refused to let history repeat itself. Jean shifts into his African-American human form and says, I took the form of those that I felt closest to here, and I hid my alien origins out of fear that you would all reject me. And the task force stand there stunned. None of them seem to know what to say, but we notice Hawkman growing uncomfortable, and he speaks up. My name isn't Carter Hall, or originally. My name is Qatar Hull, and I am also an alien. The group step backwards, and he says, I landed here 2,000 years ago, in Egypt. I was welcomed by the local gods, and they named me Horus. I lived a good life here, but eventually I was murdered by the god known as Set. But my friend Anubis saved me. He made it so that my soul would reincarnate into a human. I have lived hundreds of lives here, but this was the first one where I was able to recover my armor and grow my wings again. The tomb that Kent and I raided, that was mine. Carter looks at Jean and says, I'm not afraid of you. We then see Alan Scott speak up, and he says, I know what it's like to be living with a secret like that. Because I lied to you all too. My girl back home, Rose, well, his name is actually Ross. And he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a picture of a handsome man with dark hair. Alan Scott begins to cry as he says, and I love him with all of my heart. He looks at John and says, I accept you for who you are. And finally, Billy Batson steps forward, and he says, I have been lying too. When I enlisted to join the army, they said that you had to be 18 to join. So I lied about my age to get in. Black Canary speaks up saying, Billy, lying by a year or two isn't exactly this type of secret. And Billy says, it wasn't a year or two. He looks at everyone, growing incredibly nervous, before closing his eyes tight and yelling out, Shazam! Lightning rains from the skies, and suddenly, where the adult Billy Batson had been standing, is an 8-year-old child. Everyone is shocked as they stare at him. Dr. Fate and Hawkman seem extra cautious for a moment before dropping their guard. Diana drops to a knee and looks into Billy's eyes, confirming that this is the man that she has been fighting alongside for the last few weeks. You're just a boy. The task force then all begin realizing and recontextualizing their experiences with this man as experiences with an 8-year-old, and the horrors that he has seen. And we see Billy's eyes begin to tear up. Billy is sobbing, asking how the Nazis could be so mean, how things could be this bad, why things are like this. Diana embraces the young boy and realizes that without the wisdom of Solomon, the reality of war was hitting this boy for the first time. The boy is sobbing. He just wants to go home. He doesn't want to be here anymore. No one knows what to do, but Jean Jones approaches Billy. He reaches out a hand and asks Billy if he can help. Billy looks at the Martian and nods. Jean's eyes begin to glow as he connects to Billy's mind and calms the boy's emotions. Billy takes a deep breath and stops crying. When he opens his eyes, he reaches out and hugs Jean. Jean is surprised, and he returns the hug. This makes the entire team smile, all accepting each other for who they are. Jean stands up and he thanks his friends, saying that if they accept him, then maybe the world can too. Perhaps it is time for him to stop hiding who he truly is. And we watch as his Mahontir uniform grows back around his body, a black suit with a bright red X going across his chest and a flowing blue cape. He looks at his friends and says, although my physical appearance might still be alarming to others, maybe it would be best to ease them into it. And we see as he morphs back down into a hybrid form between his humanoid form and his true Martian form. The team all look at the green man standing before them now and say, "Welcome, Bloodwind." But John stops them and says, "I would like to use my old title. If it is all right with you all, I would like to be called Manhunter." And so, the team welcome the Martian Manhunter. A few days later, the team has managed to track the Ubermensch back to the robotics factory, and they are standing on an opposing mountaintop staring down at it, as the Flash suddenly returns, having scouted the outside. The team decide for a multi-pronged approach. Billy, Diana, and Hawkman will take the front and try to make a lot of noise to draw out Albrecht Krieger. Dr. Fate, Flash, and Green Lantern will focus on destroying the robotics manufacturing wing, while Manhunter, Black Canary, and Hourman will go and find Dr. Krieger's lab and destroy his super soldier research. Jean takes a moment to connect everyone in the team's mind psychically, so now they can freely communicate. And with that, the team head into their mission. The first trio head up front and begin making a lot of noise, attacking the facility full on. The alarms start to blare, causing enough of a distraction for Jean to phase through the walls with Dinah and Rex. Meanwhile, Dr. Fate, Green Lantern, and Flash rush the production floor. They begin destroying crucibles of molten metal and attacking the factory line. Workers rush to activate as many robots as possible while they grab weapons off of yet another assembly line to begin fighting back against the heroes themselves. Cutting back to the front of the facility, we see as Albrecht walks out and enters combat with that trio. He is keeping pace with Billy and Diana while Hawkman swoops in for pot shots in between the bouts of godly combat. And then we cut back inside to the laboratory trio. They eventually find what they believe to be Dr. Krieger's laboratory, and they begin going through it, finding incredibly advanced scientific documents. Our man looks at them and confirms that everything he is seeing is decades ahead of other scientists' work, and you can see why Dr. Krieger is so formidable. Jean is watching the hallway as Dinah helps search the lab. Dinah calls out that she thinks they may have found what they're looking for. Our man rushes to her side and reads over the documents. We see detailed anatomical drawings and measurements of Albrecht's physical capabilities, but our man's face grows more and more confused. Dinah asks him what it is, and he says that none of these documents have anything to do with artificially enhancing a human. If anything, these documents indicate that Albrecht was born with his powers. And as our man flips a page, he sees a detailed drawing of Paula Krieger with similar notes. And then a blade pierces through his chest. The entire team feel what Rex feels in that moment, and they know that something has gone horribly wrong. Black Canary is speechless, and we see Paula Krieger standing behind Rex with a Greek-style sword stabbed through him. We see that she had just stepped out of a secret doorway concealed by a grandfather clock behind the duo. Paula pulls the blade from our man's back, and he drops to the ground dead. Canary screams, but Paula dodges out of the way with inhuman speed and lunges at Canary. Black Canary dances and dodges out of the way of Paula's strikes, but Paula manages to leave some cuts. Jean rushes in so that they can fight the woman together, But Paula is exhibiting feats of inhuman levels of strength and speed. She is leaping across the entire room in a single bound, dodging out of the way of all of their attacks. And as she is doing so, she grabs a vial of chemicals off of a table. She flings it into the air and then strikes a piece of metal with her sword, causing it to spark. This instantly erupts the cloud of vapor that she just sprayed and catches Martian Manhunter on fire once again. He falls to the ground screaming, and the team's psychic connection is lost. Canary leaps in front of her friend to defend him and lets out the loudest cry she can summon, throwing Paula back across the laboratory. Back outside, feeling the loss of their communications and the death of Rex, Diana looks to her friends, and they urge her to go inside and check, and we watch as Diana flies through the facility, punching through walls. We cut back to Black Canary as she has Paula pinned, but then Paula begins to move. She digs her blade into the ground and slowly pushes her way through Canary's cry. Tears begin to well in Dinah's eyes as she tries to summon more intensity for her cry, but her lungs are beginning to run out of air, and the woman is stepping ever closer. We cut back to Diana as she is trying to locate the exact location of Canary's cry in the huge facility. We cut back, and we see Paula is growing even closer. Back to Diana, she is smashing through walls, and then back to Canary as Paula reaches her and grabs her by the throat. Right outside the hallway, we see Diana begin to panic as she can no longer hear the cry of her friend. She punches through the wall just in time to see as Paula snaps Black Canary's neck. Dinah Drake's lifeless body drops to the ground, and Diana screams in rage. Paula turns around to face her and says, "Please, Diana, that is no way for a princess to behave." Diana is taken aback by this comment and stares at Paula. Paula says, "When your mother banished me from the island, I thought the world of man would be my end. But as you can see, I have done quite well for myself." "You're Themysciran?" asks Dinah in shock. Paula bows and says, "Helen of Penopus, Your Highness." Diana cries out, asking how an Amazon could ever align themselves with these monstrous men, and Paula laughs at her, saying, "These men are simple. Mortals are obsessed, ruled by their hatred. Convince enough of them that another group is their enemy, and they will do anything they are asked. These idiots and their belief in a master race are perfect tools. They worship my son as if he were a god." Diana puts two and two together, realizing that Paula, Helen, is the mother of Ubermensch. "I remember when your mother molded you from the clay from our shores, how the gods blessed you to life. I thought you were a miracle, but you are nothing but a pale imitation of the gods. But my son, he is a god. I will be the mother to a true master race, the queen of a new pantheon, and I will not let anyone who could harm that future live." And she leaps at Diana. The two women engage in expert swordsmanship. Diana is far stronger and faster, but Paula is more skilled than any opponent Diana has ever faced. Paula weaves through Diana's blows, commenting that she has been training her son to fight since birth, and in turn, she has had decades of experience fighting someone equal in strength to Diana. Back with the factory trio, we see that they are wrapping up, but suddenly, small explosions begin going off in the facility, and we see that there are small bombs placed throughout, and they are being remotely triggered by Dr. Wolfgang Krieger as he is watching the trio over a rudimentary CCTV. But the Flash leaps into action. He sprints around the room, grabbing as many of the bombs as he can find just before they explode, and he hurls them at robots and manufacturing machinery just as they detonate. Seeing this, Dr. Krieger is furious. Back outside, Albrecht is still managing to hold his own against the two warriors. He and Billy are matching each other blow for blow, and Hawkman isn't backing down. Back inside with Diana and Paula, their battle is growing more heated, and Paula is beginning to slow down. Diana is landing some solid blows that send Paula flying back. Eventually, Paula slams into a metal support beam and cries out in pain. Paula falls to her knees. She spits at Diana, condemning her, saying that she is just like her mother, Queen Hippolyta. She disapproves of the world of man, but she's too cowardly to do anything to change it. Dr. Krieger sees this over the CCTV and pulls out a radio, immediately calling to his son, asking him to please rush inside and save his mother's life. But we see that Albrecht is busy. He is winning against the two men. Hawkman is beaten and broken into the ground, and Albrecht is overpowering Billy, wrapping his hands around the captain's throat. He begins to squeeze the life out of Billy Batson. But suddenly, Albrecht freezes, and we see the veins in his head begin to bulge. The camera pans behind him, and we see the burned and bloodied Jean carrying the bodies of Rex and Dinah out of the facility. His hand is outstretched, and his eyes are glowing red, and he says to Albrecht, "Hatred such as yours cannot be allowed to continue." And he closes his hand, and we watch as Albrecht screams. His eyes go bloodshot, and his nose begins to bleed. And Albrecht Krieger falls down, dead. And we hear Dr. Krieger's voice cry out over the radio for his son, asking where he is. We cut back inside and see Krieger panicking as he is watching the footage of Diana standing over his wife. We then cut back to Diana as she says, "Helen of Panopus, for your crimes against the women of Themyscira, you are sentenced to banishment. But for your crimes here against the world of men, you are sentenced to death." Paula cries and violently screams out at Diana as Diana brings her blade down, killing Paula. And we cut back to Dr. Krieger as he is screaming in fury. He is smashing things in his office, and after he finishes his rampage, he takes a deep breath. His eyes are sunken, his soul is broken, and he walks over to a console in the wall and activates something. A different tone of alarm begins blaring throughout the facility, and the task force wonder what is happening. Diana cleans off her blade and begins searching the facility looking for Dr. Krieger, and she finds him, and he seems eerily calm. Diana grabs him and wraps the lariat of Gaia around him and urges him to speak. He confirms that he is Dr. Krieger, and Diana asks him what these alarms are. Krieger begins to laugh, saying that he activated the base's self-destruct. Diana thinks that she can escape, and he laughs even harder, saying, "I've equipped this base with a nuclear bomb, the first of its kind. Its blast radius is nearly a mile wide, and it will leave the land in a radiated wasteland." Diana asks the doctor how long they have, and Krieger simply smiles and says, 5 seconds. Diana drops the doctor and tries to run, but she cannot escape in time. But suddenly there's a flash of golden light. We see Dr. Fate appear behind her. He grabs her shoulder and he says, "Diana of Themyscira, fate has much in store for you. I wish you well." And Diana is teleported out of the base. Just outside the facility, she turns and sees the rest of Task Force X standing there, wondering where Dr. Fate is. Suddenly, a massive golden Ankh appears in the sky, and his magical force field comes down, surrounding the entire base just before boom. The nuclear bomb detonates. We see the blast entirely contained within the magical barrier, and after a few seconds, the barrier fades. All that remains is a crater in the shape of an Ankh, and in its center, a floating golden helmet. The team mourn the loss of Kent and wonder why he did what he did. But Hawkman simply responds, saying, "It was fate." The team recuperate and head back to the front lines. We see them send Dinah and Rex's bodies back to their family, We see Hawkman return and hand the helm of fate to Inza Nelson, who collapses in tears. We see a montage of Task Force X winning the war on all fronts. And finally, it is 1945, and the Task Force are watching a celebration for the end of the war. They all stand together, wondering what they're supposed to do next. And Diana begins speaking about Dinah Drake. How all those years ago, she said that the world was afraid, and they needed someone to look up to. And Diana asks her friends if they would be willing to stay by her side and keep fighting. Jay Garrick says that he's unsure. After the war, after that much death, he doesn't want to kill anymore. Ever. And Diana says then that's perfect. They can be a group that fights to be better. A group that fights to inspire others, to show people that there is a better way. A group that truly fights for justice. And Diana places her hand in the middle and says, "For Dinah." Jean places his hand in and says, "For Rex." Hawkman places his hand in and says, "For Kent." And the rest of them put their hands in. Dinah looks at all of her friends and says, "For justice." And we see that symbol, all of them with their hands in a circle, and it fades, and we see the same symbol, hands, met in a circle, but with 3 more hands, emblazoned on the middle of a massive round table, surrounded by the words, "The Justice Society." And that is the Justice Society in my DC Cinematic Universe.